Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Kaylee Shaughnessy and I am the director of the Whittier Birthplace in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Welcome to our virtual lecture series. Tonight's program is supported by a grant from the Bridge Street Foundation. It's a special initiative of Mass Humanities. So thank you, Mass Humanities. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, who's both an author and a barn expert, John Porter. John is he's got experience from dairy farming and works with the University of New Hampshire's Cooperative Extension Program. He's a co-author of the book, Preserving Old Barns, and we're very excited to have him with us tonight. So take it away, John. Thank you.
Okay, Kaylee, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my talk is going to revolve around my book, Preserving Old Barns, and I co-authored it with Francis Gilman and Lowell Fuster. Lowell did the photography, and unfortunately both of these gentlemen have passed away. They're both older gentlemen, but they were great help as I put this together. I always like to give them credit. The history of agriculture is told by barns, and what it is agriculture changed, barns changed. And barns have always been part of our agriculture. In fact, I sign all my books with Proverbs 3, 9 to 10a. It says, honor the Lord with thy substance and the increase of thy first fruits, and so shall thy barns be filled with plenty. So barns have been kind of a symbol of agricultural prosperity for many years. Unfortunately, a lot of the barns in New Hampshire and probably in Massachusetts too are like this one on the left, a little bit of a dilapidated condition. And the reason is they're not being used for their original intent. When they were part of somebody's livelihood, they kept up with the roof and the foundation and the painting and everything. And now a lot of these are just abandoned, or many widow ladies own them for their husbands, a family and that sort of thing. Fortunately, like this one on the right, people do make the financial sacrifice to, fix them up. And even though that barn looks awfully new, I give it 4 or 5 years and that wood will age beautifully. So we kind of start our history lesson with the English barn. And this is a real special one in the Pennacook. This is probably 4 miles from where I live. I live in Boscawen. And this is a double English, which is unusual to be built that way. We think it was built as a double English, which is a sign of a prosperous farmer. Most double Englishes were connected later, and I'm going to explain that a little bit. Your more typical English is like this one on the left, a low pitch roof, barn doors under the eaves, usually a cow stable on the left, a threshing floor in the middle, and hay storage and grain storage on the right. And the real characteristic of this barn are the doors under the eaves. That kind of makes it the English barn. That was what our forefathers brought this floor plan over from England. And that barn style had been built for many years. And then as agriculture grew, and they added on to these are very small barns. This was subsistence type farming. But the one on the right, you'll see a little addition on the back. And sometimes that can be a weak link as far as snow accumulating and so forth. I grew up in Lebanon, New Hampshire. This is a barn I used to go by every day on the way to school. This is a very large English barn. And it's interesting, in my neighborhood, we have about 3 of this size. It makes you wonder if the same crew might have put them up. We're pretty sure that this one was added on the end toward the road, and maybe even the lean-to side on the south side. We're not sure. But this is a very large barn for English. Then it became common to connect English barns. As agriculture was growing, they needed more space. And you'd say, well, why do they go to all that effort? Well, they just didn't go out to a Home Depot and get lumber. It meant starting from scratch. And these barns were built so rugged that you could actually tow them across a meadow or something on skids. And the story of this one was it was hauled across the meadow, and they would put them about 10 feet apart. And you can see the little windows in the middle. That's kind of where the gap was. And then they boarded in the gap. And so this is a double English that was created from adding one barn to another. You can see they're off just a little bit in their height. It sags a little there in the middle. And then a new owner has it. And unfortunately, and he felt so bad, as he was preserving it, the south side collapsed as they were jacking it. So he's preserving it now as its original single English. Well, then time went along and our forefathers got to thinking, why are we building these barns that have a low pitch roof that accumulates snow? The snow falls off the eaves and blocks the doors. And so leave it to Yankee ingenuity. We call this the Yankee Barn. They reversed it around and they put the doors in the end and a steep pitch roof. Now, this one on the left, we've dated as being maybe 1790, which is a very early Yankee barn. But the one on the right is in the 1850s, and that's when typically more of these were built. And that was a plan that our forefathers started using. Agriculture appeared to be very prosperous in the 1850s. In fact, they said you really made money farming. And the nice thing about the Yankee barn, it was easy to add on to either end and keep extending the barn. Whereas a double English, you put an addition onto the side and it put the stable a long ways from the other one. The doors were a long ways apart. So these are very easy to add on to, a steep pitch roof, a door in the end, and were a lot easier to manage in the winter. And that's what a lot of the barns we have in New Hampshire are this style. Mainly because they're not as old as the English. We've lost some. Plus, a lot of them were built. That was a very popular design. Well, even these barns got to be too small, and they put additions. Very common to see a lean-to addition on the back, and that was often used for heifers and calves. This barn on the right had a silo on the end, and that maybe limited its future expansion. It was a little bit short-sighted. I don't know if that related to why this farm closed down a few years ago, but otherwise it would be common to either add a one-story addition or a lean-to and to expand these barns as agriculture got bigger. This is a special barn in Chichester, New Hampshire, and the Jones family made a special decision in 2001 to restore this barn and use it as part of their business. So this is a barn that is used for its original intent. It has the cows. There's actually 4 rows of cows, 2 double pipelines. And I'm sure as we speak, there are cows being milked in that barn tonight. So it's kind of neat to see that happen because a lot of these barns, aren't being used for the original intent. A very high percent of the barns built in the 1800s were used for dairy, because almost every farm had 5 or 6 cows. Okay, now we're up into the 1880s or so. The Civil War has happened. A lot of our boys saw the West, they saw flat land, and there was concern about maintaining agriculture in New England. And they started coming up with ideas. How can we make these barns more efficient? So this one on the left has this second floor where you can drive the wagons in and pitch the hay down and make use of gravity. And the one on the right is kind of the reverse. This is a bank barn and the basement's open. And so you put the manure down and pitch the manure out. So they started trying to get more efficient, trying to make New England more competitive, because the railroad had quite an impact, both positive and negative, on New England farming. It brought new products into New England, but it also allowed our farmers to, sell products to the cities. Well, you're talking about gravity. Here's a big barn. This is up in Frangione, New Hampshire. You literally drive in, that roof is almost at driveway level. You drive in and you pitch the hay down 2 floors. And from that end barn door up top, you can see the Cog Railway on a clear day. A beautiful place. Up in these barns, up in the hay lot, we have what we call the flying scaffold. This first was where some of the extra hay was stored. But then later when the hay fork came in, that actually became the place that they dropped the hay down and then pitched it off, once again, making use of gravity. And this is the hay fork on the left. This could lift up, 400 or 500 pounds of hay. They'd have a horse outdoors pulling a rope. This would go on a trolley up in the center of the barn. Then they would give a signal and they'd pull the rope, and then they'd drop the hay on the scaffold and then pitch it down. There are a few instances where they had an electric motor hooked up to the hay fork. And that was kind of a short-lived invention because electricity came to rural New Hampshire in the 1930s, and the baler came about around 1948. Once the baler came, we were all done with loose hay. Okay, we started fixing these barns up. We kind of laugh about this barn on the left with all the air holes and everything, but that actually let in natural ventilation. And then they started putting, cedar shakes on the side. Very common to put clapboards on the front, on the street side. Usually the street side had clapboards and the other side had cedar shakes. And then they started bringing water into the barn. And these barns weren't made to have water. The cows used to go out twice a day to drink. And so it created some rot and so forth, moisture. So then we get into ventilation issues. And people like to see cupolas on barns. And they're not just decorative. These are part of the ventilation, and would ventilate the hay mow, because as hay dries, you put it in dry, but it still respires a little bit. And then you'd put a channel down the roof and down the side wall with a little opening into the stable, and this doubled to ventilate the stable as well. Then we had the attached buildings. This is kind of a New England thing. And Tom Hubka wrote a book about this, Big House, Little House, Back House Barn. And he changed my thinking about this. I used to give the talk and say, well, that connected building allowed the farmer to go from the house to the barn without getting into the weather. But Tom Hubka has a very good argument that these actually were part of that time when farmers were trying to be competitive. And these are actually little industries that they had. They had barrel making, blacksmith shop, different things, shoemaking. And so these connected buildings are actually part of farms trying to be competitive in the late 1800s. Then you had the village barn. The village barn was attached to a Victorian house. It was that your village people might have a horse, a wagon, a few pigs and chickens. And once I mention this, you'll notice a lot of these are one-car garages now. And then we have our logging industry in New Hampshire. And on the left is just a simple square barn that held horses. And the one on the right was a large barn up in Stark, New Hampshire. They said it held 96 horses and 200 ton of hay. Then we have the poultry industry. And this is a barn that's been converted to poultry. You can tell because of all the windows and then the old chicken house attached. And that was used for poultry. New Hampshire was a big poultry state in the mid-1940s. We had millions of birds. And then something I found very interesting doing my book were the estate barns. And this was up in Orford. Some of you Boston businessmen owned these, and they would come up here on the weekends and enjoy their estate. They'd have the best horses, the best cows, the best sheep. And then you had the Bancroft estate in Wakefield, another estate barn copied after an English barn, an English estate in England. This is Corbin Park, the Sickle Avery farm. They were said this was part of the hay storage for the Corbin Park, where they had a wild animal preserve. And this had a beautiful cupola at one point. And then you got the round barns. They were introduced early 1900s as being a clever idea for barns and labor saving and so forth. You feed the hay in the middle, have the animals around the outside, but it wasn't that practical and not that many were built. And to my knowledge, this is the only one in New Hampshire up in Piermont. And then 1940, we're talking a history lesson, something happened that changed barn architecture forever. And that was, there was concern about milk, health safety and so forth. And the public health officials said that cows had to be milked on a cleanable, impervious surface. And that meant concrete. And guess what? All these old barns had wooden floors on the second floor. So a lot of stables were moved down to the first floor, but all the new barns, we started to build these gambrel styles with a concrete floor on the first floor and then hay storage up above. And that tended to be the new barn style. And instead of having cows in center alley and hay, all the animals were in one floor, and they were either facing head to head or tail to tail, and things went in a circle because by then we had gutter cleaners and milking pipelines. And so the new barn style was a double row of cattle on one floor with concrete floor. Then in the 1960s, another thing happened. There was invention of the truss roof system, which means you could have a roof that would span 40 feet and have no posts. So some people just abandoned the old barn and went out in the pasture and built a new one. This is Stonewall Farm in Keene, which happened more recently, but that trend happened. And as you travel around, you'll see sometimes an old barn with a new one out to the side. And then 1960s or so, there was a new trend in dairy farming I call freestall housing. And that meant the cows weren't hitched anymore. They were free to go in and out of this stall, to go to eat. You'd have a milking parlor where they'd be taken to milk. And so we started building these, what we call pole barns. And so now, instead of these barns being like 36 feet wide, which the old barns were, these are like 96 feet wide. And this is a classic picture because it shows the evolution of barns with the old barn up in the corner, the 1956 barn in the middle, and then the freestall. And if it was really up to date, the new milking parlor is there as well. Then you get up into the 21st century, margins are kind of tight in farming and so forth. And we started building what we call these hoop barns with fabric. And they were covered with vinyl. The floor print was very similar as these other barns, but with a vinyl covering. And then something else happened in the 21st century. That was the introduction of robotic milking. And whenever I explain this, people just can't believe it. But now cows can be milked with no human intervention. The cow wears a tag, the computer recognizes her, it remembers her teat placement and her health status, and the cow gets milked and exits the robot. And these barns are just big open barns inside with stalls, very little activity. They want, no disturbances, automatically cleaned. And you say, well, what makes that cow want to get milked twice a day? Well, they feed them grain in the robot, and then the pressure in the udder makes the cow want to be milked. So they make their way to the robot. So this farm has a robot room, like on the left, environmentally controlled. There's 8 robots, and these robots cost $250,000 each. So you do the math. This farm has got a big investment. So they're milking the robot. The cow goes in, it recognizes her. She enters from the exterior part by the barn, but the interior is all environmentally controlled, like you see here. Okay, now I'm just going to run you through some quick pictures of just beautiful barns that have been restored in New Hampshire. This is the Langwood Barn in Cornish. And if I mentioned the name J.D. Salinger, that would probably ring a bell with a lot of you with Catcher in the Rye. This is where he lived. He's passed away. His wife has maintained this, done a beautiful job of restoring this. This is the Townsend Barn in Lebanon. They were friends and neighbors of ours. A nice combination of barns are nicely, just nicely maintained, not fancy, but a beautiful picture. In fact, I chose this as my favorite picture from when Lowell did his photography, and I have this picture on my office wall. And then this is another one of these fancy estate barns, and it was common to have the same architect do the barn who did the mansion house. So this Fells estate has a fancy mansion house, and the same architect did the barn. This is Sanctuary Farm in Centipede, another example of a barn where a newer one was built off to the side, but they've maintained the old barn very nicely. This is Riverfields Farm in Claremore. It has a historic sign out front that Lafayette had wine and cheese here when he came to see George Washington. Probably predated the barn a little bit, but it was in that neighborhood. And kind of a neat entrance here with the entrance and the side pieces and just a beautiful setting, well maintained. The Poor Farm in Stewartstown, New Hampshire. This is a barn bridge that enters up into the high, what we call the high drive, or that raised second floor, so they could pitch the hay down. Probably one of the biggest high drives in the state, a beautiful covering that leads into the barn that would drive the wagons in. This is Pioneer Farm in Columbia, one of the few farms that got federal funding once when there was a special grant program, and they fixed this up nice. It's just in the Colebrook area. You see it as you go to Pittsburgh. This is Diamond Pond Farm in Colebrook, probably one of the largest gambrel barns in the state, probably built in the 1920s, needs some help, but just a huge barn. It's looking, I think, for a new owner. It needs somebody who's got some money that could fix this up. I'm afraid we might lose it. This is our northernmost producing farm, the Ames Farm in Pittsburgh. I call those kind of like twin barns, and they've had additions put on to make these efficient. This is the Pryor Barn in Westmoreland, a very interesting side piece there. We're not sure if that was added later or part of the original barn, but a little different architecture. This is the Frangione Barn in Chichester. An older lady maintained this up into her 90s. She just passed away a couple of years ago, but very proud of keeping this barn very nice and nicely maintained. This is where I grew up. I mentioned I grew up in Lebanon. We milked 40 cows here. I grew up on a dairy farm. Probably one of the largest sets of connected buildings in the Upper Valley. I didn't appreciate it, never thought much about it until I started doing research. But there's literally 3 barns there, and you can go through all of them without going outdoors. And we renovated these along the way. They were part of our livelihood. And then up in Moultonborough, there's a lot of old barns. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Moultonborough Neck, but that's like a little miniature Cape Cod up in New Hampshire. And there are several estate barns out on the neck. This is the Hollyworth Farm in Moultonborough. This is the Sheridan Farm in Moultonborough. A very nice set of buildings with silos and everything. This is out on the neck. This is the Windermere. This was a horse farm. Beautiful. It's got original stalls and everything in there. So we talked about fixing these barns up. It's expensive. You really almost need an excuse for reuse to justify it. And that's why even the historical folks are fairly flexible on, allowing like solar panels. The middle one's an antique shop. One on the right is a furniture store. And I think my favorite reuse, though, is like a farm stand, because then it relates to agriculture. In fact, sometimes I tell people if they're raising animals, it might be good to use the original barn for hay storage and then build a little pole barn for the animals, because even though they were built for animals, the wetness and everything can degrade these a little bit. So just a quick word on barn preservation and maintenance. Keep up with the little things. If some siding comes off, you got to replace it. If some roof blows off, you got to replace it. This old wood is very porous. If you leave it exposed, it gets bad quickly. So even if you make an ugly patch, be sure to do it if you own an old barn. In the center, winter maintenance, keeping the snow off the roof so these little lean-tos don't fall in. And then probably the biggest culprit on barn maintenance is just vegetation around the barn. And it's the easiest one to control, but you really want to keep the trees away. The top limbs brush up the shingles, the side ones mess up the siding, the roots go into the foundation. And you find that any barn, the worst condition is always near a tree because it holds the moisture in. Okay, a little bit about architecture. This shows what we call the Gunstock Post. That's the post that flares out and accepts the other intersecting beams. And you've got the braces. And I've got a little quick and dirty formula on dating barns. I get asked to date barns a lot. If your big beams are hand hewn and your braces are hand hewn, you're probably in the 1700s, and we don't see too many of those. If your big beam is hand hewn and your braces have up and down star marks, which this one here does, if you look carefully, that's probably 1800 to 1830. If your big beams are hand hewn and your braces have circular star marks, you're probably 1830 to 1880. And if everything seems to be sawmilled with no hand hewn, you're probably 1880 to 1910. Because even though we had sawmills, they weren't hewing them anymore, they were still building these up until about 1910. Then we switched to what we call more of the balloon construction, because they had the mills and they could saw the small timbers and the small 2x4s, and we had the balloon construction on the walls. So you're talking about barns and barn raisings. Some people wonder, how do they know how to do all this joint work and everything? We think they had joinery crews that came in, and they would help put the details together. And then the big barn raising was with the neighbors, and that would occur after this fine work was done. So the joinery crew would come in, do the fine work, and then these big crews of people, and this is called a pike, this stick at the top, they push it up, they use pulley blocks. Amazing what these people put up. I just marvel every time I go in a barn. Okay, a little bit about joinery. We talked about the English barn. You have the door under the eaves, which shows up clearly here. You have the major rafters, which you see here, the rafter was over each post. And then you have the nailing purlins. And on these, most of the boards went up and down. So that's usually a sign of an older barn. Now here's your Yankee barn, and by now we had more sawmills and they call the common rafters. And so you had rafters in between the major ones. Notice the door on the end, and then now the boards would be put on horizontal. This shows the tying in with the joinery and the pegs on the English. And this joinery was quite complex. You can see it's not just a simple joint. There's several interlocking pieces. And like I say, these things went together like a box. You could literally tow a barn, as a complete box. Here's the Yankee barn. Now you had the common rafters in between the big rafters. Tended to have some of the smaller lumber because we didn't have the native virgin forest. So you had more joining of those timbers. Because on an English barn, some of those long 40-foot timbers were single piece. And then these protruded out a little bit to create like a decorative soffit. And the next picture is a little bit better. You can see how that protrudes out. And we have a plate that's floating down a little bit lower. And then kind of what they call a flying plate above it that stuck out over. And it gave more of a decorative appearance and a soffit, whereas some of the real old barns, the roof came right up tight to the wall. Here's an exploded view. Once again, you'll see the common rafters, and you've got the big rafters. You see the joinery, how it's all intersecting. And like I say, they were using more of the smaller lumber by then because they could saw it out. There's a lot of the reason these barns use such big timber, it just meant less hewing. And so they were way over engineered by using those big timbers. And then the scarf joint was a popular thing in these especially in the Yankee barn when they were splicing these beams together on the plate. There's the simple scarf joint, and then this is the bladed scarf joint. And this has one extra little piece on it, and you can see that protrudes out, and that adds a lot of stability, a lot more stable than the simple scarf joint. And so that would be used on the plate. And then when we're doing barns on the left and fixing them up, often it's the bottom 3 feet or so of a post that might be in bad condition. So by using this bladed scarf joint, you can cut off 3 feet of a post and hook that very stiff joint in, save the rest of the post, and have a nice fit and help in your restoration. And that finishes it. And I try to move it along because I want to allow time for questions. I don't know if we had any gaps along the way. Sometimes we get a little freezes. Hopefully you didn't do too bad. But Kaylee, if you want to open it up, be glad to answer questions and maybe clarify things for people. And if we have a lull, I might have a couple of things I'll throw in.
Absolutely. So folks, feel free to add your question to the chat or raise your hand, and we'll let you unmute and turn your video on if you'd like.
Yeah, because the video will be fine now.
I actually have a question that I'll start off with while people start thinking of things. Do you know why so many barns are red?
Yes. Now, the old story is that it was easier in the early days on the early paint to use ferrous oxide, which is a rusting type process that would create red. And so that was a durable type paint that they could do. And that became popular. And it was one of the early ones. And so it was cheap and easy to make. And so the ferrous oxide based paint was used, which was red. And as you go further west, of course, it's not as old and it's late settlements, and you see more white barns and that sort of thing. But New England was kind of known for the red. In fact, barn red is a standard color on the color chart, like barn red. But the story is it goes back to ferrous oxide.
Well, the barn that we have at the Whittier Birthplace is barn red.
Yeah, no, a lot of them are in New England. That's a kind of a New England thing. If there's a gap, I can do one more. You want me to throw in something else? Or is there another question?
I don't see any other questions coming into the chat. So why don't you go ahead and we'll see if there's something else.
Let me add a little something, and I really would like your questions. That helps me know, what I covered right or not, and maybe to clarify some things. I didn't mention much about silos. Silos came in around the 1880s because of the research that the university farms are doing. They showed that feeding the fresh feed, the green feed, was better quality and not as subject to weather. So they would use the fermentation process to preserve it. So your early silos tended to be square units inside of a barn, and the telltale sign of an interior silo would be a little dormer window, because they would either run a conveyor or a blower up and blow into the silo. And then the lumbering and the joinery got better, and they were able to make round silos. And so they had round silos in the barn, but they still took up a lot of room and everything. And finally, the joinery got better, and they were doing better with their joints, and they felt comfortable making nice tight units, putting them outdoors, hooking them to a feed room, and having outdoor silos. And then by the 1916, 1920 or so, they started using concrete stave, tile. You'll see the big blue steel ones. And now we've actually gone to horizontal silos, because they find the upright ones were expensive to build. They had limited storage, and you could build cheaper with the horizontal silo, and they unloaded easier and quicker. So a lot of these silos you see with the plastic and all the tires on it, those are what we call horizontal or bunker silos. And that's the way most farmers do it today. So even our upright round silos are a little bit threatened by extinction now, because we just don't have many and they aren't being used. So that generate a question?
Timothy in the chat says, great presentation, thank you. And we haven't had any other questions come in.
Okay, you got to stump the barn guy. I'm looking for a hard question.
Well, I might have one if I may.
Okay.
And if you address this, excuse me, because I did have to duck out for
That's okay.
a couple of minutes, and I'm back in.
No, go ahead.
When I was a younger man, a business trip used to take me down to Tennessee to a place called the Ames Plantation, and it was a true working plantation. but it also had a stable, and it was a brick stable. And when you talked about estate barns, I would say it probably fell into that category, because it was the Ames family, the old Ames Tool and Shovel from Easton, Massachusetts, that owned this property down in Tennessee. But it was a beautiful, beautiful brick stable. And I wonder if you have any comments about stables or barns that might have been built from brick.
Well, I think you nailed it, and that it would have been limited to estate barns, and often probably designed by fancy architects and that sort of thing. So generally, I wouldn't see many of these as far as the common barn. Like in New Hampshire, the common excuse me, the common foundation would be either fieldstone or granite blocks, or sometimes they're just built almost at ground level, just on a few rocks that the beams would be on. So that would have been an expensive type barn, specially built, and probably an estate barn, and a very specialized use, like for horses or whatever. In fact, I'll just mention a good clue if a barn was a horse barn was usually little windows up high, because horses tend to chew on things, and they put the windows up high and just a little light so that it would come in on the horses. So if you see a barn, often you'd see a whole row of little windows. That was probably a stable. So yes, you nailed that. It was an estate barn, and probably a very specific design.
We've had a couple other questions come in. The first says, regarding preservation financing, how would a barn owner get financial assistance if it's even available?
I get that question a lot, and I don't have a really good answer, unfortunately. The money that is available, they're what we call barn assessment grants. And the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance has those, and they will share like 100 or so with you. And like you put in 100 and they make sure 400 or whatever. And you'll get a $500 grant, and you'll have a contractor come in, assess your barn, tell you what needs to be done, and then you're on your own to fix it. We are trying to start some kind of an escrow thing, but nothing has really taken off. It takes a lot of money to have a big escrow. We've tried public funding, but it's a really tricky thing to have public funding in private barns and private benefit. So unfortunately, there isn't too much available. I think the biggest success stories have been people who have linked in with their local historical society and made the barn a special project. And I even heard of one now that's doing a GoFundMe project. So there's a lot of these creative things, but as far as a statewide thing, we don't have anything. But if you are working on your barn, we do have 79D easement, which you should sign up for, because it gives you an easement on your barn and doesn't increase the assessed value when you fix it. Because prior to 79D, there was a disincentive to fix your barn. You fixed it up and the taxes went up. So get on to 79D. If you have a barn, you're fixing it, it will lower your assessment and it won't increase it as you fix it. You need to get signed up before April 15th. So you've missed it this year. It's a very simple application. And we have, I think, over 600 barns now in New Hampshire that are on 79D getting that tax protection. But thank you for that question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but you can get some grants to help you assess your barn and get ready for the fixing.
The other question that came in says, any ideas about the foundations of the barns? I assume it's how judging what your foundation's made of or the condition of it's in. Andy, if you'd like to elaborate better, go ahead.
Well, I did mention a little bit on that other question. Let me start the question and see if you need some clarification. But like I said, in the really early days, they basically put a rock underneath each beam. They put a series of rocks and a beam on top and built the barn. There just wasn't the technology, the time, and everything else to dig out big foundations. later on with horses and things, they could use little scoots and things and try to drag out dirt and create cellar holes. And then the common thing that was around was just fieldstone. And they were often dry laid fieldstone. And I just saw some in Plainfield 2 weeks ago that were beautiful, just perfect walls that were hand laid stone. And over there, they have a lot of flat stone, where over here we have the fieldstone. And then in the mid 1800s or so, they started cutting granite, and you'll see these big granite blocks that were dragged in and used as a foundation. So it kind of evolved from, a rock on the ground with a beam on top to digging out foundations and having fieldstone and granite and so forth. And then once we hit about the 1900s, concrete became available, and concrete was used in barn construction. So, after 1900 and up through the rest of the century, we had, poured concrete. And then in the 1970s, with those new pole barns, they started putting the poles directly in the ground. They dug a 4-foot hole to put the post in the ground. But now we're finding they just don't have the preservative quality we used to have for the posts. And we're doing less again of putting the posts in the ground, gone back to frost walls and putting the posts on a frost wall to better preserve them. And if you want to chime in for any clarification. We okay? Okay, is there another one?
Yes, we got two more. First one says, how common was it to use logs as beams? Oops, my link went down. How common was it to use logs as beams with no milling versus sawing the logs square? My barn has a lot of logs as beams with all bark still on them.
Yep, that was very common on the floor beams because it saved a lot of work, because with a floor joist, you could plane or hew just the top for your floorboards and leave round on the other side. So you see that a lot. It was just a way to save money. Because if you had your perimeter beams, those all had to be hewn on all 4 sides to be level. But very common to see them hewn on one side and the bark left on the floor bracing, because you only had to have it smooth on the top of the floor, and then they would notch the ends to intersect into the beams and leave the rest that way. It was just a way to save time and money.
Andy says, thank you, that was perfect. Charles asks, you're very knowledgeable. Do you also enjoy covered bridges?
It's interesting. There are 2 or 3 structures that kind of relate to each other: barns, ships, and covered bridges. In fact, a lot of the barn nomenclature comes from ships. Like we use the term windlass, wharfen, a lot of things like that come from ships. And it's interesting you bring up covered bridges, because a good friend of mine is one of the head bridge engineers in New Hampshire. And so where I'm a dairy person, have interested in barns, my good friend in the bridge engineering department, his hobby is covered bridges. So I haven't gotten into that, but he and I both joke back and forth about those. And he follows covered bridge books and I follow barn books. But like I say, bridges, barns, and ships were kind of the biggest things that people built.
That's all we have for questions. Oh, one more.
Okay.
You were an extension professor of what? How long did you do it? And what was your best experience in your profession?
Okay. Well, I was a dairy specialist for the University of New Hampshire from 1974 to 2006, so around 32 years. So I retired in 2006. And then I went into semi-retirement, so I still work for the university. So I still do part of my old job. So I've actually worked for UNH about 48 years now. And I was a native New Hampshire person, grew up on a farm. I got my degree in animal science at the University of New Hampshire. I went on and got a master's degree in nutrition from Cornell University. then got another master's in education from Bob Jones University. And so I've had this job for many years. I guess the biggest thrill of it is working with the families. And I feel kind of old now because I can say there are several families in New Hampshire that I've worked with 4 generations. I worked with the grandfather, the son, his son, and now the son's little kids are coming along. And I've got one that's almost pushing into the 5th. So I'm feeling kind of old. But I guess I mentioned that Jones family that renovated an old barn. You know, being an old barn person plus a dairy person, that was just a really special thing because I have to admit, I was probably one of the people that said, you know, you're really sure you want to put that kind of money into it? You know, should you get more modern? They were very insistent that they wanted to fix it up. And for me, what a nice blend to have an operating dairy farm using an old barn. But in general, I would say I've really enjoyed my career, and it's really been the people. And I have to say, the agricultural people are just really nice, honest, hardworking people. I grew up in that community. I'm a 6th generation New Hampshire farmer. My family were the early settlers of Plainfield, New Hampshire. And I'm the 1st generation not to grow up in the family homestead. All my relatives, including my father, grew up in the homestead. And my father was the generation that moved away and bought the farm in Lebanon and farmed on his own. So yeah, so I've had an enjoyable career, and I worked for UNH as a dairy specialist.
Timothy asks, I'm in Ohio and there are still numerous Amish barn builders. Are they using many of the English/Yankee construction methods?
I think they probably do. I have to admit, I'm really not familiar a lot with what they do. I'm guessing that they're probably taking a few shortcuts and doing more of the simple interlocking joints and not some of the complex ones that we saw in some of those photos. But I'm sure they're following some of those basic things, but I haven't firsthand, you know, seen their work to say that. But that early work that was done on the English barns is very intricate. And I think a lot of those extra little tabs and things have been bypassed now. And the Amish, even building modern barns, they're good. You know, I know barns in Vermont that they bring up Amish people to build the new barns because they're good builders. They're reasonably cost. And so they're not just building old ones, they're doing the new modern ones as well.
Our last question, or 2 questions ago, followed up to say, if you think working with families is your best experience, you must love Norman Rockwell's painting of the country agent. Or the county,
yeah, the county agent. Yeah, that's a classic picture that's in almost every extension office with the extension agent bending over with a kid and I think the dad in the background by a cow and a calf. And that's the classic. Yeah, I love that. Any other questions?
That is all. Ooh. Do you do these presentations on a regular basis?
Okay, I'm actually an official lecturer for the New Hampshire Humanities Council. And that's kind of how Kaylee found me. So I'm signed up with the Humanities Council, and they pay for me to lecture at historical societies, and the Historical Society pays for my mileage. So I go, all of my things are funneled through the New Hampshire Humanities Council. So I do these lectures all over New Hampshire through them. And occasionally an out-of-state one, like what Kaylee did, they find their own support and bring me across the state line. I've done some in Vermont and Maine and so forth, but most of mine are through New Hampshire Humanities Council in the state of New Hampshire.
Thank you. All right, any last questions?
We kept it within an hour. We did pretty good.
We did.
Where's Nana? Where's Nana?
All right, well, thank you so much, John. This has been very informative, and hope we see you again soon.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kaylee, for all your organization. You're very well organized, and we've been talking about this for a while, so it's been exciting to finally do this.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Okay, thank you for your good questions. That always adds interest.